Chapter 4, Hellenistic Civilization and the Rise of Rome. The Hellenistic Age extended from the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE to the definitive triumph of Rome in the Mediterranean world in 31 BCE. This period is called Hellenistic to signal that it was different from the Hellenic Age, yet very much its heir and beneficiary. Instead of being purely, it might be described as Greekish. The chief dynamic of this world was a remarkable blend of Greek and local cultures from Persia to Western Mediterranean. While the Greek everywhere was dominant, it also gave coherence and unity to the age. Hellenistic culture was cosmopolitan, a world that imagines the world as a city and the city as a world. The Hellenistic age was multicultural, open, and tolerant in ways that no preceding culture had been and no future ones would be until the late 20th century. The Hellenistic world was formed with three vast new kingdoms in the wake of Alexander's conquest. Those kingdoms weakened, and then new smaller ones emerged alongside them, and then the Romans unified Italy and systematically conquered one people after another. Alexander the Great died suddenly in 323 BCE without having made any provisions for his succession. Three chief generals of the vast Rome conquered but never governed by Alexander. They used Hellenistic monarchies. They were Antigonus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy, and they divided Alexander's empire amongst themselves. This gave rise to Rome. The city of Rome arose around 1000 BCE as a cluster of settlements on 7 hills overlooking a swampy site about 15 miles up the Tiber from the sea. The surrounding plain of Latium, hence Latin, provided fertile farmland, and the river was easily forded near Rome. In Roman tradition, the city was founded in the year now denoted as 753 BCE. For a long time, the Romans were dominated both politically and culturally by two other peoples. To the north, they were the Etruscans, and to the south, it was the Greeks. In 509 BCE, in Roman tradition, the last Etruscan king was expelled, and the Romans created an independent republic. Over the next 2 centuries, the Romans gained control of most of central Italy as they pushed south in front of the Greeks and became embroiled with the Carthaginians. First, Rome became dominant in the western Mediterranean region, and then Rome began acquiring an empire, one that would continue expanding for almost 4 centuries. And then third, Rome became involved with the Hellenistic kingdoms. Now, the nature of this government was twofold. First, it was kingships that were considered divinities, and then republicanism. Alexander's successors combined military leadership with theocratic kingship. So kings were either regarded as gods or were thought to be answerable only to the gods. Philosophers equated the happiness and stability of the realms with the benefit of the king. The Romans then took a different path. After expelling the Etruscan kings, they had a hearty distaste for the monarchy, and they instituted a set of magistrates and legislative assemblies. They were originally driven by class conflicts between the plebeians and the patricians. The origins of these two groups of people are obscure. The plebeians were small farmers and artisans, perhaps even merchants. Patricians, from the word pater, father, patricians were well-fathered men, such as landed aristocracy. Now, eventually, the foremost differences between the two orders were eliminated, and Rome became, at least technically, a democracy. It was actually a republic ruled by representatives, but it was an early form of democracy. Now, the tenor of life in Rome can be explained in several categories. The first is the experience of women. The Hellenistic women were affected by the period's growing cosmopolitan. Boy, that's a heck of a word. Women, along with men, moved to a newly conquered land and created new lives for themselves in frontier towns. In Alexandria, another large city, some restrictions on Hellenic Greece were maintained, but others were relaxed or discarded. So, for example, royal and non-Greek women were actually able to conduct their own legal and economic affairs. Royal Greek women were still forced to use a male guardian in such cases. Dowries, the practice of paying someone to take your woman, remained the custom among Greek families, but unmarried, respectable women now had the option of working in the liberal arts as poets and physicians. Alexander's mother, Olympia, was a powerful, influential woman, and several times women of Ptolemaic family ruled Egypt. Unmarried women who were unconcerned about their reputation served as courtesans and prostitutes and lived outside the norms of respected society. Hellenistic literature reflects the change in mores, portraying women in carefree situations apart from the gaze of their husbands and fathers. Despite these changes, Hellenistic society was dominated by a masculine way of thinking, and women were subordinate. An example that proves this is the idea of the Greek practice of infanticide, in which female babies were killed at birth. Now, urban life was also very important in that the world was around cities, and cities were the heart of that. And then these values arose that the Romans decided as practical people, they wanted to invest in what was useful. Possessed of this virile moral sense, they were inclined to view intellectual brilliance with suspicion, so they cultivated a closely related set of values. Piety, normally loyalty and dependability. Gravitas, or gravity, meaning a deep-seated seriousness. Constantia, constancy, preservation, dedication. Magnitudo animi, or magnanimity, greatness of the soul, or lack of concern for wealth and status. Now, in Hellenistic culture, drama and literature were both in the forefront. And again, we talked about the new comedy and the menanders in the last presentation, chapter 3.3, I believe. But new comedy was a way to appeal to the pleasure-seeking audiences who were flocking to the theaters. Two particular writers stand out. They were Theocritus and Apollonius. One created a new poetic form, the pastoral, and the other wrote ideas, which were small portraits or vignettes of society. Gradually, the Romans encountered and assimilated Hellenistic literature, and Latin, the Roman language, was at first an unimaginative functional language best suited to law, finance, and war. But with the growth of law and oratory in the early republic, grammar was standardized, vocabulary was increased, and word meanings were clarified. As the Romans conquered, they made Latin the language of the state, except for in the Greek-speaking East. Latin literature began to flourish in the middle years of the republic with history, lyric and epic poetry, comedy and tragedy, traditionally in Greek style, but then more towards Roman, distinctly Roman style. The letters, what we would consider writers of the time, were dominated by Cicero. He dominated Roman letters in his own day, so much so that his heirs often labeled the age of Cicero. By translating Greek treatises into Latin, he created a philosophical vocabulary for the Latin language where none had existed before. For centuries, his collected speech served as models of both public oratory and written argument. Similarly, his philosophical tracts set the agenda for generations of thinkers and reformers. He is still studied in rhetoric today. Now, the philosophy and religions of the Hellenistic age are outlined on the screen there and really don't need repeated. Roman gods and their goddesses have been listed, and several others as we compare them with the Greek. But religion was becoming less important as they adapted from the Greek and moved to a more humanist perspective. In addition, science and technology began to grow, and that was dominated with military technology. Offensive weapons, swords, daggers, pikes, spears, maces, and bows. Defensive weapons included swords, shields, helmets, and body armor. Artillery, including the catapult, were created. Architecture was dominated by the Corinthian temple, which embodied the Hellenistic splendor. Its column first appeared in the Hellenic period, the Corinthian column, when it was probably used as a decorative feature. The Corinthian column was now used on the exterior of temples erected in Hellenistic buildings for their kings. The Hellenistic taste decreed that the Corinthian column was appropriate for massive buildings. This also led to sculpture of the time period. Including those listed on your screen, and which will be discussed in greater detail in the next presentation. Now, the legacy of the Hellenistic world is urbanism, the focus on the city, cosmopolitanism, the idea of the city is the world and the world is the city, and then science and philosophy.